Hello, and welcome to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Christian apologist Brian. Keep on. All right, today we are going to be uh, doing an interview with Tim Chaffey of Answers in Genesis. He is one of their speakers, but he also does. I think he handles the content of the. I think maybe the Creation Museum. Um, but in any given case, he's going to be here today, or he's going to be doing an interview with us, and interview with me, and uh, we're going to be doing an interview with Tim Chaffey, and we're going to be talking about discussing the case for the Genesis 1 to 11 as historical narrative, and we're going to be start jumping right in just a minute, but I do want to point out something first. I decided to not include who I'm interviewing anymore in the titles. I usually do that just to let you know who's interviewing, but there are two other ways that y'all can figure out who I'm interviewing. One is from the thumbnail. A lot of times the thumbnail will show some kind of indication that I'm who I'm interviewing, and secondly, from the description box, which I will also explain who I'm interviewing. There's a reason why I decided not to include it in the title. One thing, it helps with videos with longer titles. You can only allow the YouTube won't allow you to put like 100 words in a title, so I only have so much space to work with, and I do want to put the Genesis series still in the title, so you know that it's still part of the same series. Um, and another reason is because they say it helps with um, shorter titles tend to be able to be presented easier or something like that. It just makes it easier for people to access it or find it and on the YouTube and that sort of thing. So I'm going to shorten the title by not including the person who I'm interviewing. Like I said, it will be in the description box. I'll probably have some sort of way in the thumbnail to indicate who I'm interviewing, so that way I don't have to put it in the title anymore. But you will still know that I'm interviewing somebody. In this case, Tim Chaffey. All right, but anyway, without further ado, let's dive in. Well, hello, and welcome to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Christian apologist Brian Keith Bowen. Of course, we're doing a Genesis series, and today we are going to be starting or going to be doing a video on a case for the his Genesis 1 through 11 as historical narrative. So we're going to be talking directly about Genesis 1 through 11, and particularly in its literary genre. And today we have an interview with Tim Chaffey from Answers in Genesis. And would you like to introduce yourself, Tim?
Yeah, hi Brian. Thanks for having me on. Tim Chaffey, as you said, with Answers in Genesis. I'm the content manager here for the attractions division. That means that I'm responsible for writing or overseeing the writing of the content for the exhibits that people see when they go through the Ark or the Creation Museum. And I've been doing that particular role for about 10 years. And for 3 years before that, I was in the web department as a writer and an editor. But all of my training, as far as school goes, all the way up through my THM, is in uh, church history, biblical studies, theology, and in a couple of weeks, I'll be defending my dissertation for my doctorate, and so that's in advanced biblical and theological studies as well. So that's my training. I'm not a scientist like a lot of the people that I work with, but so my training's in uh, the biblical and theological areas. So this should be right up my alley. I'm not a textual scholar in the sense of being able to analyze the Hebrew and the Greek at a very deep level, but I can read those who do that, and I think we'll be able to address this issue pretty well.
We'll talk a little bit about that today as well, because I know Stephen Boyd has done some significant work on this, and so y'all have piggybacked off that. And in fact, he includes a chapter in this book right here, coming to
Coming
grips
to
with
grips.
Genesis. Yep,
That one right
that's
there.
it. Yep,
Yep.
he includes a chapter in that. I have a quote from him, but I'll get to that later. But in any given case, yeah, and you have a master's in biblical studies, is that correct? Biblical studies and
Uh,
theology.
M- yeah, MA in Biblical and Theological Studies. My MDiv specialization was Apologetics and Theology, and my THM is Church History and Theology. And then I mentioned my doctorate is Advanced Biblical and Theological Studies.
Awesome.
Well, my doctorate
Essentially,
that I almost have. Let me, I don't have it yet. I still have to
right.
defend it, but Lord
That's
willing, within a
awesome.
few weeks. Yeah.
I've been trying to. There's been some exceptions, but mostly I've been trying to keep whatever the topic matter is relevant to whatever the expert. Just like when I did uh, the origin of the universe, I did that with Dr. Jason Lau because he has a PhD in both astronomy and physics, and so I've been trying to keep it very relevant to that the expert relevant to the particular topic matter. And so your biblical studies, like you said, it sits right at home at what we're going to be talking about today, because we're going to be talking about the literary genre of Genesis 1 through 11. Um, so if you want to, we'll dive right into this. Um, on my first question, I have just basically lay out a okay. I know there's good external evidence as well, from the Old and New Testament for Genesis 1 through 11 being historical, and we'll get to that later. But right now, on this question, I want to focus on the internal textual evidence, the evidence from the text of Genesis 1 through 11, that this is indeed being presented as if it's real history. So lay out your case for that.
How long do we have? No, no
Well,
let's just,
as long as we want, but
yeah, maybe I'll just do a quick overview of that, and then we can push back on some of those, or we can nail down some of those in a little more detail if you'd like. So first and foremost, the text as it is written um, is historical narrative. The style matches what you see in other chapters of the Bible that are widely recognized as historical narrative. Um, it doesn't mean that there's never any use of figurative language. For example, in Genesis 4, when God is speaking to Cain, he says, "What have you done? You know, your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive it." Well, obviously the blood wasn't crying, and the ground didn't have a mouth that opened up to receive it. But we instantly know what those two figures of speech refer to, and so historical narrative can use figures of speech. In fact, right now as we're talking, we use figures of speech all the time, don't we? Well, not all the time. I just used one. That was hyperbole. It was we use them a lot, and that's what I meant by that. So when you read Genesis 1 through 11, the the style of the genre matches the rest of Genesis 12 through 50, other than chapter 49, which is where Jacob is blessing his sons. That is written in like a poetic uh, form. And in Hebrew, poetry is different than what it is in English, where we would focus on a rhythm or a meter or rhyming. In Hebrew, a lot of it is based on parallelism, either parallel thoughts or antithetical thoughts, or one line will say one thing and then the next line contrasts to that. So it is more about the the meaning and how it's written, and it's very complex, but it's very recognizable. And Genesis 1 through 11 isn't written that way. It's not poetic or semi-poetic, as Meredith Kline argued. And so just from the genre itself, it's clear from the language that it's historical narrative. You can do what Stephen Boyd did, where he did a deep dive on the types of verbs that were used, and so he talked about like the Vav consecutive imperfect, where you have this. Essentially, if you think about writing history, and when you read history, it's this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's not always completely sequential, because sometimes you have to back up, fill in a few details, but it's not like a listening to somebody read one of the Psalms, or somebody singing a song where you have all sorts of flowery figurative language and all sorts of metaphor and everything else that's in there. It is um, it's a kind of a straightforward accounting of or recounting of what happened, and that's what we see in Genesis 1 through 11. And uh, we can talk about in the New Testament or even Old Testament. Look at how did those authors or characters in those books, how did they refer to those chapters? How did Jesus treat Genesis 1 through 11? Well, he talked about Noah and the flood as being historical events. He talked about the first man and woman being historical people. He talked about Abel being the first person who was murdered. They're all treated as though they were historical. Paul did the
Right.
same thing, talked about Eve being beguiled by the serpent. So they all
Tim,
treat this as historical.
you're moving much further than I am. I'm
How
going
much
to
that?
get to all that, but that's what I just wanted to focus on the text right now, Genesis 1 through 11. Yeah, the the verb consecutive with the imperfect verb, the mytho, that's what you're talking about. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
series of it starting in verse 3 all the way down to like, what was it, 2-3, something like that. Genesis 2-3. And so and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. This is very indicative of historical narrative, what we expect from Hebrew historical narrative, at least.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think when Dr. Boyd did that study, what he showed is that in historical narrative passages, you have an average of 1.6 uses of that, the Vav consecutive imperfect, compared to poetic, where they only have zero point 0.3 uses of that per verse. So more than 5 times as frequently it appears in historical narrative, and that's what you see in Genesis 1 through 11. It matches that style. So it's it's illegitimate to try to claim that Genesis 1 through 11 is poetic. Um, so what and I think a lot of people know that. They know it doesn't match Hebrew poetry, so they're coming up with different genres. People are trying to classify it as myth or mytho-history. I think that was is that what William Lane Craig said about a year and a half ago when he released his
yeah,
uh,
the last
that
video. The last video I did was with Simon Turpin on responding to William Lane Craig's mental history.
that not to get off subject too much, but I did a paper on that in school on his book, reviewing his book. And what I found fascinating here, he's striving so hard to be academic, and let's make no mistake, he's a smart man. William Lane Craig is a smart man. I'm not questioning his intelligence, but what he did in that book was so um, let's just say if he did that as a report in school, he would fail instantly. Any professor, yeah, that one. Any professor would fail him for that because what he did is he's continually critiquing a young Earth perspective. How many times did he actually quote a young Earth creationist?
Not that many. That
How
was
many
one of
times?
my complaints about it too.
3 times, and they're all in footnotes. And instantly, as soon as and he doesn't really even quote them. He summarizes a short statement by them, and then right away says, "But this wild interpretation." Right? So he never once actually deals with the scholarly work, like the one we talked about earlier. This is by Terry Mortensen and other scholars. Terry's just one of the
Or
editors
this
there.
one. This was out at
Yeah,
the time.
or that one searching
Yeah.
for Adam. I wrote a chapter in that one toward the end, and he never dealt with either one of those. And so there is scholarly work that's put out there by Young Earth Creations that he never even addresses. Um, so we're getting far afield, but that's the mytho history that people like William Lane Craig or people will say Genesis 1 through 11 is just a polemic or it's just ancient Near Eastern history. It's written the same as that, and none of those things hold up. And ultimately, I think the reason why people are searching for a different genre is because if you take Genesis 1 through 11 as straightforward history, it says God made the world in 6 normal length days just thousands of years ago, not billions of years ago, like many scientists are telling us. And for whatever reason, some people want to make the Bible conform to that, and I think that's the wrong approach. We have God's word, the word of the one who knows all things, who's told us what He did, and it's recorded for us. So why would we not go with that over the views of people whose ideas change all the time?
Right. That's awesome. I actually am writing a response book on responding to Bill Craig's book. Actually got legal permission from his publisher to do that. So, but when he first put his book out there, one of the things I was afraid of was because of William Lane Craig's influence. He would, influence lots of people, and then they would just agree with him because he's a very successful apologist. He's written a lot of even some good stuff on the resurrection and things like that. And I was afraid that because of his influence, a lot of people will take him. But a lot of people, even a lot of older creationists, even theistic evolutionists, there's a lot of people that actually rejected his views on that. Because there's people that have taken classes with him that have said that they don't agree with it. So it wasn't as it's not in spite William Lane Craig trying to popularize that idea, it didn't really become very popular. Not as far as the whole mytho-history thing. Now, there is something going around among other theistic evolutionists concerning ancient Near Eastern texts and viewing that as myth. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so one of the guys who's popular in that is John Walton, and he's written the Lost World of Adam and Eve, the Lost World of Genesis, the Lost World of the Conquest, the Lost, and essentially what he's doing
Tim, you're
is
breaking
looking
up.
for any concept or idea in any other. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm not moving anywhere, so I don't know if my signal's.
I
How's
think
it
your
right now?
signal was just constantly messing up. But can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. All right, continue.
All right. Yeah, so John Walton, what he's been doing, what others have been doing with his so-called ancient Near Eastern approach, is they're looking for any sort of writing from in and around Israel, within a few hundred miles of Israel, in any time period that goes from about 2000 BC up until about the time of the return from exile, 400 to 500 BC, somewhere in that range. And if they find any idea that seems a little bit parallel, like, oh, well, the biblical writers were just responding to this. They were just writing a polemic against this, or they were borrowing these ideas. And there's nothing wrong per se with writing a polemic, with, okay, well, the Canaanites have these gods, and we want to address that and why those things are wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. But what's wrong is if the only thing the biblical writers are doing is creating a made up history to attack the made up history of the other group. If you're saying this isn't real history, it's not supposed to be taken as real history because it's just a polemic against this other view. Well, the only way it's a successful polemic is if it's true. And so you don't really solve the problem. But I think one of the biggest errors and in this this whole ancient Near Eastern approach is the how selective they are in the the this the parallels that they're drawing. So they don't talk about the vast number of differences. They don't talk about the difficulty of why would Israelite slaves in Egypt who just come out of slavery and now they're coming into the promised land. Why would these people be super familiar with a whole bunch of Sumerian and Babylonian myths from, 800 miles away and maybe 500 years earlier or even later in time? And so there's just this assumption that if it comes from that area of the world in the ancient history, well, these people knew about it and therefore, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially before you have the internet and mass publication and all sorts of other things. Why would they be familiar with some of those ideas? Sure, there's certain big picture ideas that would cross cultures. There was trade at that time, and so some of that stuff is possible. But to just assume that the biblical writers are addressing a Babylonian motif or a Babylonian myth when they're writing when Moses is writing Genesis 1 through 11 um, after the Exodus, um, I think that stretches credulity and it doesn't match how the later biblical writers viewed the text.
I actually have John Walton's books over there. I was sitting there looking for them, and they're on the shelf, but I'm not gonna bother getting them right now. But I actually did a video with Simon Turpin. The first video I did with Simon Turpin was on responding to John Walton, and I think Simon made a very interesting point there. Be you would have to be because John Walton treats that like nobody ever thought of these things until they discover these ancient Near Eastern texts. And the reality is that it's kind of he kind of acts like this is a revolutionary view of his. Well, anyway, he was saying be wary of a view that nobody has said at all, for the past 2,000 years, and suddenly these texts are discovered, and they think, oh well, uh, uh, now we must interpret Genesis 1 to 11 in light of this text that's found.
Yeah, you don't want to assume that nobody was able to interpret the Bible properly until these ancient Near Eastern texts were found. Now, with that being said, there is value in understanding in some of these and understanding the cultural, historical backdrop of when the biblical passages were being written. And there may be certain instances where those other texts will shed light on biblical passages, historical background, things like that. Just like it's similar to how we study Josephus, to help understand the New Testament, because you have this historical writing that helps us understand the cultural backdrop and the historical backdrop for the New Testament. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't use Josephus to reinterpret the words of the New Testament. And at least in that case, you're dealing with somebody who is living at the time books of the New Testament are being written and in the same culture that those books were being written. Whereas this ancient Near Eastern stuff is be hundreds of years separated, and they could be hundreds of miles away, and we're just in a completely different empire, a different culture, and we're just assuming they were familiar with it and they thought the same way. That's a mistake.
Right. The biggest problem probably happens the way they're trying to argue this, because they don't just argue that okay, we can use this and look and see if there's some things in the background that could shed some light on certain things in the text. Whether they're saying that the literary genre of Genesis 1 through 11 is the same as the literary genre of these ancient Near Eastern texts. Now, when they say that, I kind of see fundamental differences there. These texts in ancient Near East are written in kind of a poetic style. Of course, of Genesis 1 through 11, or any part of Genesis, was that it would be written in parallelism, and parallelism is the most, like you mentioned earlier, is the most indicative feature Hebrew poetry. But most indicative feature of Hebrew poetry, and we see that in Genesis 1 to 11, the only time you ever see anything poetic is when someone is cited, like when God said, the man should leave his mother and father and cleave to one woman and be one, or be one flesh, and then Genesis 2, Genesis 3, we see, or is it 2? No, 2. Genesis 2. We see Adam seeing his wife for the first time. He says, "Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." And then you got Lamach's boast in Genesis 4, but that's only when people are speaking. And even Craig noted that in his book. He does actually note that that's the only time you ever see poetry. But he claimed that he thought it was on the edge poetic, like it has some kind of poetic form flow to it, like it's almost poetry kind of thing. What would you say to that?
Well, I would again, I'd go back to it's the same genre as Genesis 12 through 50, other than chapter 49, which is Jacob blessing his sons, the same as Exodus, the same as Leviticus, the same as Numbers, the same as Deuteronomy, the same as Joshua, the same as it's historical narrative. It's not almost poetry. It's not semi-poetic like Meredith Kline said. It, it, it it's a different genre, and it's treated as such by the biblical authors and by Jesus himself.
Right.
And
And I always
and
wondered
so
that. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Uh,
I was gonna say, so that's the example we should follow. If these are the one, if Jesus is our authority, and he is, as Christians, you can't get a higher authority. If he tells you Abel was a real person and was the first one who was murdered, if he tells you that Noah and the ark were real events and the flood was a real event, as he does in Matthew 24, then I'm going to go with him.
yeah.
He's not accommodating the errors of his day. Just I mean, that's another theory that's out there, the accommodation theory, and that's a problem as well.
No,
Peter Enns promoted that idea.
if Hebrew poetry is indicative features of parallelism, I don't see how some text could be almost poetry. It doesn't make any sense.
Oh,
Not
and to that point, the our English Bibles do a good job of formatting those those sections differently. They'll indent it a little bit and they make it look like it's in verse, or that it's in. They'll Most of the time you can see just in our English Bible, because of the way that the translators can recognize those things, that hey, here's the part that's poetic, here's the part that's narrative. And I'm not saying that the translator is the authority, but they recognize where something is poetic and where it's historical, and and they write it as such.
Yeah. And King James version, if you're like a King James onlyist, King James version has that kind of poetic feel to it, the way it's translated because of the
Yeah,
archaic
there's a
English.
rhythm, which is probably why it's easier to memorize the King James a lot of times, because it does sort of have a rhythm to the way that it's written. But
Right. I want to cite something from Coming to Grips with Genesis. This is from the Hebrew scholar Stephen Boyd. He wrote that chapter. Um, and he said that my findings in this step, that where the probability of Genesis 1 through 2 3, his narrative is between 0.999942 and 0.999987 at a 99.5% confidence level. I conclude that it is statistically indefensible to argue that this text is poetry. Would you agree with that?
oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that he only found when he did a statistical analysis of, was it 500 some passages, like 270 were poetic and the rest were narrative. There was only one outlier on each side, and one of them was like Ezekiel 19, where it's like this. It's actually apocalyptic, and so that's why it would be an outlier. And and you would expect it in those two cases where he found outliers. But Genesis 1 is not like that. It matches all the rest of the historical narrative in terms of the analysis that he was doing, the types of verbs that were being used, as we talked about before. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And yeah,
Okay, awesome. Now there are some other textual cues also in Genesis 1 to 11. I remember reading an article that you wrote. I think it was like part two of a series you were doing, but you wrote an article and you mentioned some things that I thought was good because I already knew about them, but I wanted to bring them up. Chapters 11, because as far as I can tell, at least on the Christian side, everyone agrees that chapters 12 to 50 is historical narrative, as far as that goes. And chapters 11 kind of not well, chapter 11 flows into chapter 12 in a kind of very fluent way without changing the genre. The genre just kind of keeps on going. And on top of that, chapter 11 is actually connected to chapter 12 through a vowel consecutive. And you mentioned this too in your article.
yeah. Chapter 11 ends with this genealogy that takes you from Noah's son Shem all the way down to Abraham, to Abram. And chapter 12 begins with God calling Abram out of the Ur of Chaldees. And where does this Abraham come from if it's suddenly drawing from a passage that's supposed to be mytho-history or from poetry? If Abraham's not a real person, if it's just this mythical thing, then you got a problem. But it's not just Abraham, because Genesis 11 has that genealogy that takes you back to ultimately to Shem and then to Noah. Well, where did Noah come from? Well, we see the genealogy of from Adam to Noah in Genesis chapter 5, but it's not just there. That same genealogy appears in First Chronicles, and it's treating these as actual history. And a similar genealogy appears in Luke chapter 3, where it takes you from Jesus all the way back to Adam. And if Adam is just a myth, if if he's not a real historical individual, then I think we've got some problems with the rest of our Bible and why these individuals are treated as though they are um, real people. So where does Abraham come from? Is that really where we start the Bible? Is Genesis chapter 12? This is where the history really starts, and just God calls some guy named Abram that we've never really heard about before because he's obviously a myth in the previous chapter. Uh,
Yeah.
so so it creates problems, but you also have in Genesis 12 through 50, you have these sections that are known as Toledot. So it's like the generations is the book of the generation of so and so, and so it's broken. I think there's five of them or six of them in Genesis 12 through 50. Guess what? You have the same thing in Genesis 1 through 11. it's the same sort of formatting where these different sections are kicked off or ended by this is the book of so and so of the generation of so and so, and it's the same wording in 12 through 50 as it is in 1 through 11.
The toledotes I
And
find
I
interesting.
think
If I'm not mistaken, this is my understanding. The toledotes actually represent sources that Moses likely used when he was compiling the information. Is that correct?
that is one view that's out there. I'm not sold on that. I think there are some problems with it, but I can see one. I can see the why people would like that view, and I don't think it's impossible. But I do. I think there are probably too many obstacles to overcome with that. But it's I guess it's plausible. Maybe I'll put it that way. It's just not the view that I would favor. But I work with people who do like that one, and I think we need to make sure that the reason we like it is based on strong textual evidence rather than, oh, well, if this is true, then it would mean that this is proof that Adam wrote something, or that Seth wrote something, or that Noah wrote something. It shows that these people were intelligent, which that might be the case, but that shouldn't be why uh, we shouldn't accept a view just because it would provide something that we
Right.
would like. We should only accept it if the text is giving us that
Now,
information.
now, just a kind of point of clarification. This is the view that Stephen Boyd took, though, in Coming West with Genesis. Then he considered this kind of like sources that it did use sources. The Genesis 1 through 11 use
Sorry, you cut it. Yeah, you cut out a little bit. You said who
uh,
used that in coming?
Stephen Boyd.
Okay.
Is
Yeah,
that right?
and I think there's you have to distinguish between that these would be sources or these people actually wrote this. Like I know somebody who looked at Genesis 5:1 where it says this is the book of the generations of Adam or something, and they'll say, see, Adam wrote a book. Wait, that doesn't, I wrote three novels about Noah. It doesn't mean that Noah wrote those. I mean, they're called Noah
Right.
something.
I don't favor that view.
I wrote them. Yeah, and so that's what I mean about that. That's where I was drawing a contrast. But it's a I think one of the problems with it is you have Babel happening in Genesis chapter 11, where God confused the language, and suddenly people have they go their separate ways with different languages. And Hebrew is not like the original language in Eden. That's one of the popular views that some Christians have, and it's really not supported by historical evidence at all. It's the Northwest Semitic language. It's sort of like English in the sense that it's kind of a mutt language. I know we don't like to. Sometimes people get frustrated with that. They're like, "No, this has to be the heavenly language." And why? The Bible's written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It doesn't have to all be Hebrew. And um, so, if if you have these earlier sources before Babel, and those are somehow passed down to Moses, then there'd have to be a way of for him to translate that original to understand that. So I think that's one of the difficulties, but there's others. So
Out of personal curiosity, on your master's for biblical studies, do you take Hebrew and Greek classes? Because I'm looking into taking a master's course in biblical studies, and half the core classes are like Hebrew and Greek classes. So I didn't know if yours.
yeah, it did. No, mine was not language heavy. I mean, I did take. I've had a couple semesters, but it wasn't a language heavy thing. That's why I said at the outset I'm not a textual
Right.
scholar in the sense of being able to dive deep into the Greek and the Hebrew, but I can um, I guess that makes me dangerous. I can do a little bit of it, and but you have to know your limitations, and that's why when I have a question about Hebrew, I call up somebody who studied directly under Stephen Boyd for 8 semesters and keeps right in touch with him all the time.
Chapter 11 does end with Abraham, and chapter 12 does start with Abraham. So that's also something that's interesting because that kind of keeps the flow from chapters 11 through chapter 12.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the point that we were talking about before we got on a little tangent about the Toledo. Um, it, the there's no clean break in style in if you want to say, well, genealogies, no, there's a genealogy in Genesis 30, what is it, 4, 35 with it talks about Esau's descendants, and so that's not the only time you have genealogy. Um, and so there's no clean break in style, there's no break in subject matter. It's just taking you right from Adam it's essentially tracing the messianic line from Adam through by the end of it, you're going down through Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob and his descendants, and you're learning about how God provided for them in Egypt during the 7 years of famine through Joseph being down there. So uh, um, that again is a one consistent theme, not from poetry to suddenly now there's real history. It's real history from the very beginning all the way through.
Another thing is that something that Stephen Boyd noted is like the origin of names and sayings. Like Genesis 4:17 has the origin of the city that was named after Enoch. Um, and Genesis 11, I think that's 4. It has the origin of the name Babel because the word Babel meant confusion. Would you see stuff like this as examples of something that's being presented as historical? And he also put historical footnotes too. There's like historical footnotes that are sprinkled throughout the text and stuff like that. Like Genesis
Well,
four
you have a
nineteen.
similar,
I'm sorry.
yeah, I think that that's a great point to make that these are they're telling you the origin of these places. Now, I think the city of Enoch would have been wiped out by the flood, but you have Babel, which apparently was just left in, when people departed. But you have the origin of that. But you see a similar thing in Genesis 12 through 50, where the origin of certain things are named. Whether it's a certain well, they were called this, or even the same sort of naming convention for their children. When a this one will, Noah was named, and then so this one will provide rest from the ground which the Lord God had cursed. That's what Lamech had said, his father. Um, and Noah, there's like a word play going on there with the word rest and everything. Um, and you see the same sort of thing when Leah is naming, like her son Judah. Now I will praise God, and so same sort of thing taking place in Genesis 1 through 11 as you see in 12 through 50. But the naming of places and telling you the origin of those things is saying this is historical. Why would you put that in something that's mytho-history? It's not written in that style. It's not written in poetry. And frankly, I think that's one thing we should bring up. It was hardly ever even considered anything other than straightforward history until about 1800, until the rise of the millions of years. And then people started to look for other things. I know some people will say, well, but Augustine, okay, yeah, I think you got to be careful about quoting Augustine. You have to understand his background, how he interpreted the Bible. He was a Manichaean, like a Gnostic for a while. He was Neoplatonist for a while, and then he. There's a reason why some people call him the great allegorizer. When you read his writings, he's a smart man, but his
Augustine in his earlier
literal
writings.
comments.
Oh, I was going to say,
Well, he's got
I'm sorry.
so he's got these commentaries on Genesis, and one of them he calls like the literal commentary on Genesis, and it's just on Genesis 1. And then he later on goes back and revisits that and he calls it the unfinished literal commentary on Genesis. But what he means by literal is far different than what we mean by literal. Like his in the literal commentary on Genesis, the way he interprets like the creation of the fish and the birds on day 5, it's not actually creation of fish and birds. It's the creation. The fish are the mass of unregenerate humanity, and the birds are those that have been redeemed out of that. And that's
Wasn't he
not
part?
literal history.
Wasn't he part of the School of Alexandria, like Origin in them, or the school meaning of
so, uh,
about?
so he was in Hippo, which was in Africa, but actually he learned how to interpret his. He picked up the allegorical approach from Ambrose, who I think was in Milan. And so, Augustine, when he was younger, and he became a rhetor, studied rhetoric. And it wasn't until he heard Ambrose preach that he came to this idea that, oh, we can, I'm going to say allegorize for lack of a better term. That's really what it was, though. We can allegorize the text, and then it will make sense to me because the Manichaean view, this Gnostic view, and was like a hyper literalist thing where it says in Genesis 1, and God said, "Let there be light." Well, if God is spirit, he doesn't have a mouth, therefore that can't be taken this way, therefore we can't believe this at all. And then when Augustine heard Ambrose allegorize things, then he was thinking, well, I can do that. And he ended up doing that with large portions of the Bible, including Genesis 1 and other chapters. So I would be reluctant to go back and look at what he said. I would rather look at what does Paul in his inspired writings in the New Testament, how does he treat Genesis 1 through 11? How about Jesus? How does he treat Genesis 1 through 11? So I would go to that.
Right.
But still, the point is, it wasn't until the late 1700s, early 1800s, when Christians started to try to find ways around the straightforward history of Genesis 1. You get the gap theory proposed in 1804, where somehow there's this gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, where you can dump the millions or billions of years. In the 1830s, you get who is it, William Miller with the day age theory. Each of these days are long periods of time. And then you get progressive creation later on. You get framework hypothesis, which is saying that Genesis 1 is kind of semi-poetic. And so you get all these different views that are being proposed. And now you got the ancient Near Eastern, you got the mytho-history. And what they're doing is they're getting further and further and further away from the text every single time. And it's very clear why they're doing it. It's very clear why William Lane Craig was doing what he's doing. He's trying to say that evolution occurred. He's trying to he's trying to satisfy the secular scientists who believe in evolution, and maybe he has. I don't want to question his motive. Maybe he's got a goal in mind where he thinks that that's going to be more effective in leading them to the gospel. But
You
I
actually,
would say that God doesn't need he doesn't need our help in terms of our ingenuity, our cleverness. The gospel is a simple message. Christ died for our sins according to scriptures. He was buried early on the third day according to scriptures. And yes, we can try to persuade and we can talk about it with people, but it's not for us to change God's word to make it more palatable.
when you read Craig's book, half of his book is trying to dismiss Genesis 1 through 11 as history. And then the second half of his book is talking about his evolutionary views and speculations about who he thinks Adam was. And so, since he basically says we can't trust the text as stated, pretty much, I mean, that's what it was coming out to me, Genesis 1
Yep.
through 11. And then the he could have sat there and said Adam and Eve were, popsicle sticks. It wouldn't have mattered because
But
he,
they lived 700,000 years ago.
yeah,
The Adam did they say Homo habilis or Homo heidelbergensis?
yeah,
Habilis, I think.
that's correct.
Yeah. And yeah, there's no way you get that from the text. And really you can't even include, I know people try to put gaps in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, um, but it doesn't work. When it says Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, it people will say, well, you can have a gap in there where Adam's like his grandfather, his great grandfather. Fine, for the sake of argument, let's say that. He's still 130 years old when Seth is born. It doesn't add any time.
It's
And
also
so it doesn't accomplish what they think it accomplishes. So it doesn't even make sense.
and something that Dr. Johnson Party noted is that they overlap as well. Like it's not like that somebody was born and they just died right then. They continue living on after that person was born and then they died. That's another thing I wanted to talk to you about, the genealogies, because they often include some irrelevant details that doesn't seem to match up. If this was fictional, if this was poetic, if this was parable, if this was allegorical, the object would be to try to get to the point. You wouldn't want to drown over all these other types of details, but in historical narrative, we expect it. And in Genesis 5 and 10 and 11, when you see the genealogies, you often see like when someone was born, how old somebody was when this person was born, how old they were when they died, and that sort of thing, and the kinds of details that I often see as well, like the fact that when it talks about the flood, like in Noah's Ark, it doesn't just give the dimensions, like because even the Epic of Gilgamesh gives a dimension. It's an absurd dimension because the boat is like the shape of a cube, and so
Yeah.
it would get capsized in turbulent waters. But and so the dimensions are perfect, but it also talks about the pitch on the inside and outside. So that could be some kind of waterproofing agent or something of that nature. And so you've got these very specific details that seem to would bog down a text that is not intended to be historical.
Yeah, so in the genealogies, for example, you have the end of Cain's line in Genesis 4. You have Tubal-Cain, who's described as the instructor of all kinds of bronze and iron in Genesis 4:22, and then like his two half brothers, you got Jabal and Jubal. One of them like the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. The other one is the those who use musical instruments and names a couple of different instruments. And why would you have those sorts of details if it was just this mythical thing um, that would seem to be irrelevant? And I know some people might say, well, if you look at Homer, the Greek gods and everything, they were the god of this and the god of that. that those are written in such an extremely different style than what you have in Genesis 1 through 11, where it's just a straightforward reporting. I'd even tell you that, like in Peleg, it talks about how in his days the earth was divided. So sometime during his lifetime, the earth is divided. And so it's giving you details about this person, that something that happened during his lifetime, um, which is not appropriate for something that's just meant to be mythical, if that's what it was meant to be, especially if this is an inspired text, because then it's giving you details that are not true. Because in that case, Jubal and Jabal wouldn't, and Tubal-Cain would not be the instructor of all kinds of bronze and iron for Tubal-Cain. Somebody else was, because this is a mythical person who didn't really live. And so then you're giving not only just irrelevant details, you're giving false information, and that would be a problem if this is an inspired text.
Right. And before we jump into the New Testament, I was as a question in my notes, I was wondering, um, is there evidence in the Old Testament for the Old Testament authors, other Old Testament authors, looking at Genesis 1 to 11 as historical? I know that the usual passage that's usually brought up is Exodus 20:11, so we have to talk about that one because that's the one that gets brought up the most. But there are probably other passages as well. What do you think?
Yeah, well, let's start with Exodus 20 verse 11, and the reason the way I'm going to go about it, I think it's probably going to be a little different than a lot of creationists would go about it. They'll look at it as a commentary on Genesis 1 through 11, like so if your listeners aren't familiar with it, it's where in the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. And then God tells them they're going to work for 6 days and rest for one. And then he says in verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rest on the seventh day. And they'll look at that and say, see, God worked for 6 days and rested for one. The Israelites are supposed to do the same thing. I think we should look at it the other way around. And what I mean by that is if you were one of the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses is getting this revelation from God on Mount Sinai, and then he relays that to the people. Which passage did the Israelites hear first? Exodus 20, verse 11, or Genesis 1?
Genesis 1?
They heard Exodus. They
Exodus.
heard Exodus 20 first. They were there so they're slaves in Egypt. They don't have the book of Genesis yet.
Yeah.
They get to the foot of Mount Sinai and they're given the Ten Commandments and other commandments as well, and other instructions, the 613 laws, if you will. Um, but they get this message relayed through Moses from God. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. The rest of the seventh day, we're going to work 6 days because that's what God did. And then at some point during the wilderness wandering, or maybe while Moses was still on Sinai, God reveals that information in Genesis 1 and ongoing to him. So the passage that the Israelites would have got first is Exodus 20, verse 11. So when they hear Genesis 1, how are they going to understand that? God worked for 6 days and rested for one, the same thing that we're supposed to do. So there's
So
a
in other words, you see it as a
it's
commentary of Genesis 1 rather than, or how would you say that exactly?
so it is a commentary, but it's like a pre-commentary. This is how the Israelites would have understood it because that was already in their head from Exodus 20, because that's what they were already told that God did it in 6 days. And then Moses would elaborate on that once he has that revealed to him. So sometime during that 40-year wandering, probably early on, but sometime during that. And so I think it's pretty clear from the text that that's how the original audience would have understood it.
In other words, what
And
you're
there's no
saying is,
reason.
oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
In other words, what you're saying is that Genesis and through Deuteronomy, these were books were written after that time on Mount Sinai, which it was. I think all Christians agree at least that it postdates the Exodus event as far as the writing of the books. And so
Right, and so the giving of the Ten Commandments was one of those first things that Moses got, and then comes down from the mountain and he's got those tablets, and of course breaks them because of what the people are doing. He goes back up and gets that message, but that was like the primary message they get, and then the rest of that is filled in after the fact. And so that would have been, in fact, it's repeated in Exodus 31 as well, 17 and 18, that God made everything in 6 days. So that would have been their first understanding of that. And then when they read Genesis 1, they're like, oh, these are the 6 days that this is what God did. They wouldn't have thought, I wonder if this means millions of years, or I wonder if this is poetic. No, they would have already been told these are the 6 days God made everything in.
okay, before we move on from Exodus 2011, I got a couple questions. On Exodus 2011, I read a Biologos. Of course, as you know, they're a very big theistic evolution organization. And I read an article one time. I responded to the article on my website. But anyway, in the article, they said that or the person said that wrote the article, that because Exodus 2011 talks about God in the third person, that automatically would mean that this is written by somebody else later during the intertestamental period, and therefore it wasn't actually written um, uh, by a Jew living around that time or whatnot. That it was just kind of like written later by some unknown person, because because God refers himself in the third person, like the Lord God made the heavens and earth and that sort of thing. So how would you respond to that?
Well, a couple things. You'll see God can refer to himself that way if he wants to, and you'll see that in other places. It does not require it to be an intertestamental period passage. But primarily I would look at oh, let's see. There's this guy in the New Testament. Oh yeah, the Son of God,
Jesus.
Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
says that Moses gave the law, that it came through Moses as a real person. So I would go with that. Again, Jesus is the authority, and if he says Moses was the one that the law came to, and then Moses gave the law to the people, then it was Moses. It wasn't an unnamed intertestamental period person who wrote that. It was Moses.
Of course, I'm an amateur historian, so one of the things that I found fascinating, this is something I've done a study about a while back, is that in ancient times they often spoke in third person. The Gallic Wars written by Julius Caesar is entirely in third person. You got the Gospels, you got Jesus when he talks about himself, like the Son of Man has no place to lay his head and things of that nature. So you see these kinds of third person references. Thucydides in History of Peloponnesian War, he starts his entire preface off in third person. Xenophon, Anabasis, and has third person references. So you got
How about,
this
how
kind of
about
stuff
today?
all through history.
Have you written papers in seminary?
Not
You
yet.
can't write first person. You don't get to. I mean, it makes it a lot easier if you could say I think this or I, but you don't get to do that. You got to say things that sound kind of weird. This researcher, this student, and you got to write third person.
Yeah,
So,
I've had to
um,
do that in college because when we do research papers, they expect you to write in the third person, and I find that very
but
difficult sometimes because I'm sitting there saying okay, because you want to express what you're saying, but you can't say I'm saying it.
right,
So
but
like
then you
this
also
writer
have.
says,
But remember, this is going back to the Exodus 20 issue. This is God telling Moses, "Go tell the people this." So if he said, "I made heaven and earth in 6 days," Moses, go tell the people. Then is Moses going to say, "I"? Moses didn't make the heaven and earth. So it
right,
makes sense why it would be Lord God because he's going to be conveying the message. Um, so yeah, to me, it's just that's a. I haven't read that article, but if that was the reasoning behind it, I find that to be rather bizarre and really stretching, especially again because Jesus tells us Moses is the one that the law came through. So um, he was a real person who did that real thing, and we'll go with that.
right. All right. The second thing I wanted to ask you about is that do you see Exodus 2011 as a kind of a typology of Genesis 1 in one sense because it talks about the work week. If you go back to the context, verse 8 through 11, talks about how you work 6 days and the seventh day you rested, and God likens that rest to what He did on the seventh day or the seventh day after the day following creation. So would you consider that a typology? Which a typology is not a figure of speech. It's like In a way it is, but it's not like that. It's more like a comparison between two different things that actually happen. Like David and Jesus are often considered typology of each other because Jesus sat on is supposed to sit on David's throne, and David, was prophet, priest, king, and that sort of thing. But it doesn't really
Yeah,
change
so
the meaning.
yeah, and so here's I'm probably a little different than a lot of my fellow theologians or aspiring theologians. I am very reluctant to call something a type unless the Bible calls it a type. So you have like the bronze serpent that lifted up in the wilderness. I If Jesus himself didn't compare himself to that in John chapter 3, I would have never drawn that comparison. Wait, there's no way Jesus is going to be compared to a serpent, right? But he does it. He compares himself to that about being lifted up, and that he's talking about how he's going to be crucified. Um, like Abraham and or sorry, Isaac carrying his own lumber to his own what was probably going to be a sacrifice till God stops Abraham. And it's probably on Mount Moriah, is one of the mountains of Moriah. So maybe perhaps the very spot that Jesus would later be crucified on. That seems to be a type. I think it had all the hallmarks of it, but the Bible never comes out and says that, so I'm reluctant to even call it one. But there are some. Um, so I probably wouldn't use the terminology that it's typology, but even if it was, like you pointed out, it doesn't deny the historicity of either one. It's just a just that there are similarities between the two individuals or similarities between the two events that somebody can draw that connection and say there's a type. And I think that one of the reasons I'm reluctant is because there are people who are quick to jump on that and use that to say, oh, this one is not literal history, or they'll use it to reinterpret that other thing and say, well, it's really about this. Like when people will have like like if you're familiar with the Christocentric hermeneutic, where they try to say, oh, Jesus is on every page of the Old Testament or everything's about Jesus. And I think that, not that I want to, uh, I hope people don't take this the wrong way. I'm not trying to minimize Jesus in any way, shape, or form, but I don't think it's legitimate to reinterpret David and Goliath and say it's not really about David and this Philistine giant. It's about Jesus. No, it was actually about David, the guy who would become king of Israel, defeating a giant, and he trusted that God would give him the victory. And as a result, eventually he becomes king. And guess what? He is in the line to the Messiah. So yes, it's connected to Jesus, but it's not. The passage itself is not about Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yes,
And so that's one of the reasons why that's one of the reasons I'm a little reluctant to do the typology thing. But I think you're right in pointing out that even if it is, and if people want to classify it that way, it doesn't deny the historicity of either the type or the antitype.
right. Now we got to the part that I know you've been itching to get at. The historical evidence from the New Testament. And I want to know what evidence from the New Testament that we have that they considered Genesis 1 to 11 to be real, presenting real history.
Yeah, and before, if I can back up a little bit, because you had asked me, we just kind of focused on Exodus 20, verse 11. Well, you have Deuteronomy 32, 7 through 9, where Moses is referring to the Tower of Babel, the Babel event. He tells the Israelites to ask your fathers, and they'll tell you when the Most High divided the nations and set their boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. He's referring back to that event in Genesis 11 as a real historical event. So that's in Deuteronomy 32. So you had asked earlier if there's other, of course, First Chronicles borrows the genealogies of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, and really the history in throughout Genesis. It's borrowing as it traces the genealogies in the opening chapters of First Chronicles. Um, so yeah, there are other Old Testament books that refer back to Genesis 1 through 11. But yeah, let's jump into the New Testament then. The New Testament clearly does that. You have Jesus multiple times referring back to people and events in Genesis 1 through 11 as real people and events. He doesn't use the name Adam and Eve, but he talks about the first man and woman. God created them male and female. He talks about in Matthew 19, that's also in Mark 10. And said, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." What's interesting to me is he quotes from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in that passage and puts them together seamlessly. So there are a lot of like liberal theologians out there who are saying, "Oh, Genesis 1 is one creation account, Genesis 2 is a different creation account, and they contradict each other." And Jesus is like, they put together just like this. They don't contradict. Um, and so he quotes from both of those, but as real history. That there really was a first man and a first woman. That Abel was the first one to be killed. Well, that's what Genesis 4 tells us. So that's literal history. He talks about how the Noah and the flood came and took them all away. All the people they didn't know the timing of the flood until the flood came and took them all away. And the day that Noah entered the ark. So you got Noah, the ark, the flood. Jesus says real history. This really happened. Um, And then you have the same thing. Peter refers back to the flood, talking about how it destroyed that world. Um, and he talks about Noah in the days of Noah. Well, God's long suffering waited in the days of Noah, 1 Peter 3:18 through 20. So he refers to Noah and the flood as real events. And and also 8 people surviving, which is exactly what we read in Genesis 7 and 8. Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their wives. Um, so they match. Paul again talks about the first man and about the woman being deceived. He talks about Adam was made first, then the woman. That's in what he wrote to Timothy. So you have that as being part of the argument that he's making in terms of the roles with men and women. And so he just throughout the New Testament, and of course, the book of Revelation draws on Genesis quite a bit. You have um, the tree of life in the New Jerusalem. Well, you had the tree of life back in the garden, and you see these parallel ideas. What was there at the beginning is going to be there at the end. You have it, and when Peter talks about being a restoration of all things, a restoration of what? if if there's going to come a time, as Isaiah talks about, where the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and uh, where the lion's going to eat grass like an ox, he's hearkening back to something else, that something that it was at one time and it's not anymore, but someday it's going to be again. But if you're adding the millions or billions of years, if you're trying to reinterpret Genesis 1 to make it fit with like an evolutionary scheme, when was there ever a time that the wolf and the lamb lay down together? When was there ever a time that the lion ate straw like an ox? There wasn't. So those passages don't make any sense. If God is going to restore it back to what it once was, it never was like that before. If you're taking an old Earth view and you're buying into the evolutionary aspect that, for hundreds of millions of years, these creatures were living and dying and killing each other, and God called all that very good. That doesn't match the biblical description of things, and it doesn't match New Testament theology that is looking at the beginning to show us what the end, what it's going to be like in eternity.
And that's something me and Simon went over a lot of these New Testament passages, including the one about Adam and Eve with Paul. He mentions that, and he also mentions Eve being deceived by the devil and things like that. And so these have their grounding in Genesis 1 through 11. When I did some research on this while back, I was completely impressed with. I know we usually bring up the origin of marriage, and there's certain usual passages that we bring up all the time, but then I sat there and looked at it, and I was just blown away by how much evidence is in the New Testament for the Genesis 1 through 11 as historical narrative. You got Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about Noah moved with fear in the preparing of his ark for his family. And you got all
Talks about
these
Enoch.
references there. Huh?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you got Enoch, Noah, Sarah, Abraham. Yeah, you got all those from Genesis that are right there.
awesome. Yes, definitely. And so I think most, when I looked at it, most of the New Testament seems to, except for maybe a few places, a few books, but most of the New Testament at one time or another referenced Genesis 1 through 11.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And so if that is just mytho-history, if that's just poetry, if it's something other than historical narrative, then why are these people quoting it as though it is historical and that these things really happened, these people really lived? And I alluded to it earlier when like Peter ends as a promotes the accommodation theory. He's a theistic evolutionist, promotes that Jesus just accommodated the errors of his day, because rather than trying to correct them on some sort of thing about the first man and woman, that doesn't really matter. Why get into that? Let's just focus on what we need to focus on for our day. No, Jesus is not accepting error. Whenever Jesus saw error, he corrected it. And I think you have a huge problem if you're going to say that Jesus willingly taught error, or even unwillingly. If you have Jesus teaching error in any way, shape, or form, there's a problem. He's our sinless sacrifice. He's the perfect Lamb of God, and he's not somebody who sinned or was teaching something out of ignorance. You know, so that the whole accommodation theory is just uh, yeah, it's extremely problematic from a theological perspective, and I think it diminishes the person and work of Christ. Even though they're doing it as a well, I don't even want to give them credit on that one. That's just a big problem. So
Right. I have a question. What would you say if somebody took the view that, okay, that, certain things like marriage and things like that, I'm okay with them illustrating points, but they're illustrating, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they thought that the text in question was historical narrative. They're just using that to make a point or to illustrate something or something of that nature. What would you say to that?
yeah, you'd have to look at the context of what's being done. Who is the person who's doing it, and for what reason? Who are they speaking to? How is that crowd going to take that? How is it being written down? And so the reason I say that is that if I were to give an example, and if I were going to be teaching something, and I would say, kind of like with when Hercules did this. If the crowd I was speaking to was familiar with Hercules or something, and I wanted to illustrate something with Hercules, it doesn't mean I'm thinking that Hercules is a real person. Okay.
Like
Um,
when Jude appeals to certain uh, like text that was not actually inspired scripture. The
well, Jude refers to Enoch.
Yeah,
He quotes from Jude 14 and 15 quotes Enoch, first Enoch, and he alludes to it in a couple other places in his letter. Um, so it it's not that it's not that First Enoch isn't accurate in those cases. It is because Jude is using that authoritatively. It doesn't mean that he thinks that First Enoch is canonical. So because even non-canonical books can be right about. I mean, I would hope so. Otherwise, why are we referring to this? I mean, that's a non-canonical book. it's, um, there are a lot of writings that are not inspired by God, but they can still be accurate. Math textbooks
yeah,
can be accurate, and somebody can cite that. So yeah, Paul quotes pagan poets that would be a better example. I think Paul quoting a pagan poet or something to make a point. Um, but there's no indication in the text anywhere that that's what Jesus is doing or that that's what Paul is doing. In fact, Paul in what is it, First Timothy 2, when he's talking about these different roles with men and women, he says that the reason for this is because Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. Then he says that Adam was created first. He refers back to the created order, that this is the basis for his argument that he's making. So if I were going to make an argument that's supposed to be binding on people, or try to build a case for a doctrine or for a practice that's supposed to be binding, I wouldn't say because Hercules did this thing. You know what I mean? You would go back to what truly did happen, and that's what he does. So yeah, there's no indication that they're referring to something um, that they didn't believe was historical. Because Jesus even says Abel was the first one murdered, from Abel to Zechariah, that they've been killed. He wasn't saying from this mythical person to one who's not a myth. So
yeah.
yeah,
And
the burden of proof would be on the person claiming that these individuals viewed this as not as ahistorical. So where is the proof of that?
Luke actually includes Adam in the genealogy of Jesus. And you wouldn't do that unless you think that if you got a historical person like Jesus and you're including genealogies in it, then everybody in that list would be real. It'd be kind of like someone saying that that I'm really that Brian's genealogically related to Mickey Mouse or something like that. It wouldn't make no sense if it's a fictional person and that sort of thing. Yeah, but if they're included in the genealogy, then the assumption would be that Luke is saying that this is a real person that Jesus is related to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you have not only do you have these passages that explicitly teach that Genesis 1 through 11, the events and people in there are real events and people, but you have the theological points that we were talking about earlier about the restoration of all things, that we have something to look forward to this when um the creation is redeemed, when it is restored, because what it was originally was perfect. It wasn't something that was, that has always been full of death and suffering and disease. We don't look forward to that. We look forward to a place where there's no more tear, no more sorrow, no more pain, no more suffering, because guess what? That's what it was originally. That's how God made it. And so if you think that he made a world full of those things and called it very good, what are the characteristics of God? Is he a God that loves death and suffering and disease and says it's very good? Or is he a God who is pure and holy and just and merciful and loving? Yeah, he's the latter. And that matches his character. The other one, making a world full of death and suffering for millions of years and then saying very good. And then sin does nothing to the world because the world's already full of thorns and thistles and death and suffering. And so Adam's sin doesn't really affect the world at all. That doesn't match the biblical view in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I noticed that you laughed when I said I was related to Mickey Mouse. I might look like a cartoon character, but I have a thumb, so I'm good.
Yeah. What? They always give them like three fingers, don't they?
Yeah.
Like most cartoons, I think there's a thumb and like three fingers, and it's always weird to me. I work with a bunch of artists. I should ask them why they do that. Probably just easier. I don't know.
Yeah,
Anyways,
basic. On the early church, um, they also perceived Genesis 1 to 11 as historical narrative. Now there were a few exceptions on Genesis 1. You mentioned it already, or at least mentioned Augustine. Of course, others would be like Origen, which is famous for allegorizing everything in Scripture. And usually, Origen and Augustine is the two that they usually bring up, don't they? Now
a lot of times,
sometimes,
and
well, I was going to say
go ahead.
sometimes they bring up Irenaeus, but if you actually read Irenaeus's work, and I have, he actually considered Genesis 1 to be literal. He thought of it like a typology because he thought that the Genesis 1 was a type for the coming of a Messiah, how long it would take, how many thousands of years it would take for
Right.
the Messiah would come. But he did
And
consider it literal.
and I think that's an interesting thing that people need to keep in mind is that a lot of times when the church fathers were addressing Genesis 1, like the days of creation, that kind of thing, they weren't having the same argument that we're having in the last 200 years. They weren't dealing with people who were saying the earth is millions of years old. And they're like, no, 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 let's go back and look at Genesis. It's not that, it's only this. That wasn't the point of why they're bringing it up. So often they talked about it, like you just said, it was more about a almost like an eschatological discussion that each of these days are literal days, but they represent 1,000 year period. And so they thought the earth would be around for about 6,000 years, and then there'd be 1,000 year um, period, like the kingdom or something like that would be the seventh day of rest sort of thing. And so they're having more of that discussion. Um, so a lot of times when people jump to the church fathers for this debate, a lot of times the church fathers were discussing something different. But what is relevant is that they were not dismissing Genesis 1 through 11 as historical narrative. They were treating it as though it was a real history. And um, so it's just, I think sometimes people try to force, like I've seen with Augustine, they'll try to say he was a young earth creationist because he said that um, Adam lived, less than not 6,000 years had passed, or not five, since Adam. And it's like, well, but he also could have believed in millions of years before that, but that wasn't really a before Adam. You know what I mean? That wasn't what he was trying to argue one way or the other. He wasn't setting out to be young earth or old earth creations. He was just allegorizing the text in many ways, but still believing that they were real events being described. Um, so sometimes we try to force, how do I say it, like non-combatants into the battle for us. You know what I mean? They weren't having that argument, and we try to bring them in on one side or the other. You know, Hugh Ross tries to bring in all these church fathers, and he even includes in the list people like Philo and Josephus. I'm like, they're not church fathers. They're
And and
they're
on top of that, Josephus did actually take it literally, and he did believe it was less than 10,000 years old. I mean, it actually has his writings that he actually says that. Philo, though, did actually allegorize everything in Scripture, but his views was very influenced by Greek philosophies and things like that.
oh,
And
absolutely.
and
Yeah, he's one of the
yeah,
first Jewish writers to buy into the allegorical methodology developed by the Greek philosophers about 400 or 500 years before him, and that's kind of where that started in Alexandria. And
right. If I'm
for
not mistaken,
for the
that's where
Jewish
the
writers,
I'm sorry, I was going to say, if I'm not mistaken, that's where the School of Alexandria basically got influence as well.
yeah. So what you see in Athens, in 500 BC, roughly, you see the Greek philosophers start to they invent the allegorical hermeneutic to, in a sense, rescue or save the gods. Homer and Hesiod, because the people loved those writings, but they realized how absurd some of the actions of the gods were, and so the philosophers are becoming more rational in a sense, and they're saying this is um, we don't need these things or we don't want these things, but people love their stories. And so then they develop this way of allegorizing the text so that, yeah, you can keep these stories, but they just stand for other things. Zeus isn't really a god per se. He just represents, you know, lightning or thunder, whatever it might have been. And it's a way to keep the story giving it a different meaning, and that satisfied people, and that influenced the way that Philo and others started to interpret the Bible. And so Philo did that in Alexandria, and that influenced a whole uh, group of Jewish writers in the next generation or two. And you see some of the rabbis going that way at the end of the first century and into the second century. And then that happened with Christian scholars as well. And starting about the middle of the second century, you see some of them starting to allegorize certain parts of the text. And especially by the time of Augustine, who's writing, he dies in 430 AD. So about 400 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is when Augustine dies, and that's about when allegory became really popular within the church. And it was through Augustine primarily. And there were others who influenced him, but then he was the one who really made it popular.
Yes, and all of the church fathers, even Origen, took the world as being less than 10,000 years. None of them actually took an older perspective. You don't start seeing that until around the late 17, 18, around the 1800s. That's when old Earth creation started coming up, was when these views started to become popular. And of course, uh, just to be clear, I'm not committing the genetic fallacy. My position is that I think old Earth creation is wrong because it is conflict with, contrary to what Scripture says. But what I am saying is that these views do not actually go into existence until these kinds of views become popular during this period of time. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I mean, that's just what we see historically. That was kind of my point earlier, is that they weren't really having this debate necessarily, the early church fathers, and even throughout the medieval period, people were not really having a big debate on the age of the earth, because there wasn't any real pushback against the idea of it being just thousands of years old. And it wasn't until the late 1700s with James Hutton, and then early 1800s with Charles Lyell, where you get these people who are pushing the idea that it was millions of years old, and now they say billions of years old. And then that becomes conventional wisdom, so to speak, that everybody believes, that all the scientists say that allegedly. And therefore we have to find a way to make the Bible match that. And I think, no, if the Bible clearly teaches something, then that's the way it is. I'm
Some people think that
um,
the a scientist that we're supposed to, okay, if a scientist says something is true, then we're supposed to interpret the Bible according to what these secular scientists are claiming. What would you say to that?
I would say similar to what I was talking about with history earlier, or the other writings, like the ancient Near Eastern writings, they can inform. our understanding of things, but they are not determinative of that. The scientific understanding can help us. They can inform our understanding of certain things in Scripture. The Bible is not a science book, so you don't. If you're going to teach a science class, you don't say, "Okay, our text is the Bible. Let's learn all about geology from the Bible." Well, the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about the the makeup of rocks and the different levels, the different types of rocks and everything. But does it touch on geology? Yeah, the flood would have a huge impact on geology. And so where it does touch on geology, it's right. The Bible's not an astronomy book, but where it touches on astronomy, where it talks about God made the sun, moon, and stars on day four, it's accurate when it talks about those things. It doesn't, it's not a biology book. But when it tells us the animals will bring forth after their kind, or the plants will bring forth after their kind, as it talks about 10 times in Genesis 1, it's accurate. And that's all we've ever seen. We've never
Yes.
seen dogs become something else. We've never seen cats become something else. They dogs stay dogs, cats stay cats, and they're bringing forth after their kind, just like Genesis 1 says that they would. So it's accurate when it deals with science. But if it's an area where the Bible doesn't really speak to it, or it has very little to say about the subject. Science can inform our understanding of certain things. There's no question, and we shouldn't run from the study of science. We should embrace studying the natural world, and but to do that with the right perspective, understanding that the basis for that comes from our Creator, and that He created an orderly world, and He told us about that in His Word.
Yeah, I think science wouldn't even be possible apart from a biblical Christian worldview. Um, uh, I think that atheists can practice science, but they'd have to borrow from our worldview in the process because order and design and things like that, and discovering patterns in nature, these only make sense within a biblical Christian worldview. But
Well, they certainly don't make sense in a naturalistic
yeah,
worldview. I mean, there are some people who would argue like an Islamic or anything, but we don't need to get into that. It's just they certainly don't make sense in an atheistic naturalistic worldview. There's no basis for laws of logic, morality, for natural law, that kind of thing. Yeah, they're completely. Yeah, I agree. So
right. Um, um, uh, would you consider this to be an important issue as far as the literary style? Would you think that as someone who specializes in biblical studies, would you say that okay, it's important for us to understand the literary style of the work in order to know how to appropriately interpret it?
yes, absolutely. Um, I think that we need to understand the the genre of a text when we're reading it. The same thing when it comes to non-biblical writings and when it comes to biblical writings. You have to understand what style of uh, text literature you're dealing with to know how to interpret. So when you're reading something that is poetic, you understand you're going to be getting a lot of metaphors and things that are a lot more figures of speech. And so you don't always necessarily take it as literal history. So uh, a good example, and Stephen Boyd talks about this in his chapter. But if we just make a comparison in Exodus chapter 14 and Exodus chapter 15, you have in chapter 14, you have the historical narrative description of the Red Sea crossing after the Israelites come out of Egypt and God guides them across the Red Sea. It's the one that most people are familiar with if they read through Exodus chapter 14, and how that God caused a strong east wind to blow, and they were able to walk across on dry land. And then then the Egyptians went into the sea and were drowned. But then if you read chapter 15, it's the same passage but put to song. It's the Song of Moses. And when you read through that one, it says that God has thrown the horse and rider into the sea. But we know that the horse and rider, they rode into the sea and then were covered by it. It says the Lord, Yahweh, is a man of war. Well, he's not a man, he's God. It says that he has cast Pharaoh's chariots and army into the sea. Um, they sank to the bottom like a stone. And then it goes on to tell, it says, with the blast of your nostrils. the waters were gathered together. Um, it says that he, let's see, you stretch out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. No, it was the Red Sea that swallowed them. Um, and it even talks about how, let's see, there's one place where I think he talks about how he crushed them or shattered them, that sort of thing. So when we read those two passages, if you're taking both of those as strictly literal, you're going to have some problems in chapter 15 because it's written as poetry. And you have to understand that it's written as poetry. And so, therefore, you're getting a lot of figures of speech and you interpret accordingly. And in 14, it is historical narrative. So, you know, you're getting a straightforward reporting. Yes, within narrative, you can have figures of speech, but we instantly recognize those figures of speech, or at least usually recognize them right away as figures of speech. And it doesn't, we don't reinterpret the whole passage because there's a figure of speech. Therefore, we have to take this in a non literal way. No, you still take it for, you take it in its plain sense.
Yeah.
And that's how history is written. So you can do the same thing if you compare Judges 5 and 6, with Deborah and Barak against Sisera. You have the historical account in one chapter, you have the song in the next one, and you can see the same sort of thing where one is very straightforward and easy to follow. The other one, it's
You
got
mean
all this.
you mean Judges 4 and 5, right?
Did I say 5 and 6? Yeah, 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. Um, yeah. So you can do the same comparison there, and you'll see the difference between the historical narrative and the poetic, and it's very easy to see the difference. And that helps you understand why genre it's important to understand a text. You need to know the principles for interpreting a given passage, and even in I have somebody who recently responded to something I had written, and they responded on my blog, and they were attacking me for I can't believe you don't believe the Bible because it says this, this, and this. And of course, they're giving all sorts of generalities. It said over 200 times this. Well, the only thing they were talking about was something that appears in um, poetic passages. So something like Hannah's prayer in First Samuel, what is it, chapter 2? Even though the First Samuel, by and large, is historical narrative, you have Hannah's prayer, which takes up a large chunk of one chapter, and that is poetic. And so you have to understand the difference between poetry, the different principles for interpreting poetry versus interpreting historical narrative versus interpreting apocalyptic literature. And so, yeah, genre is extremely important when it comes to interpreting the Bible.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't accuse somebody of not believing the Bible because they tell them there's something in a poetic passage that they say is a figure of speech. Well, that's kind of to be expected.
Right. Um, uh, Also, in the case of historical narrative, the like you said, it is heavily contextualized when there is a figure of speech. Um, and if they ever want to see what a creation account would look like in poetic language, well, we got one in Psalm 104. So it's called the Creation Psalm. So you read that and you could tell what it would look like if it had that form to it. Um, and there's something I did want to ask you. This is brought up by a lot of theistic evolutionists. I consider it a red herring, but I was going to see what you think of it. But sometimes they'll sit there and say, "Well, wait a minute. There is poetic language in other parts of the Bible, and what they're basically doing is setting up to say that Genesis 1 to 11 is poetic or should be at least possibly poetic because there are poetic sections in other places in the Bible, such as Revelation or figures of speech or anything like that. They'll raise that up as an objection to the idea of taking Genesis 1 through 11 as history. What would you say to that?
Um, well, yeah, just because there's poetry elsewhere does not mean that it's poetry within Genesis 1 through 11. Each text needs to be studied on its own to see what genre it is, and you can do that through the statistical analysis, like Dr. Boyd did, um, with an extremely high degree of certainty, like he showed. But you can also look at how other uh, authoritative individuals viewed those passages, and sometimes I think it's just common sense. I think a lot of times we can quickly spot it and recognize what it is. And I think maybe sometimes people are just overthinking it to but I think ultimately what it comes down to is what's the motive? What's the goal? Is it to truly find the author's intended meaning, or is it to find something that is palatable in our day and age? Is it something to try to help me fit a different idea that I'm bringing to the text and performing eisegesis rather than performing exegesis, where you're just reading out of the text? And that's not just for Genesis 1 through 11, that goes for anything in the Bible, um, or with whatever you read. But especially with the Bible, because it is authoritative. What does the text actually say? Not what do I want it to say, not what does Dr. So and so say it says, what does it really say, and what does it mean by that? And that's what we need to be focused on.
What the original author intended. Your reference to author intended meaning, I remember that from your article in which you actually came up with this acronym AIM, AIM. And I thought that was pretty clever. Is that your
Yeah, it's not
acronym
original
or
to me. No, I don't remember which. I've had so many different hermeneutics classes at the undergrad and even graduate level, and now doctorate level. I don't remember which professor I heard. I think it was even undergrad that one of the books we read for hermeneutics was, which is how to interpret, had that acronym AIM in there, and that's always stuck with me. It's the author's intended meaning, and of course that just makes sense for anybody outside of a postmodern worldview. When the sender of the message has always been the determiner of the meaning, up until the postmodern day, where it's no, the receiver is the one who determines the meaning. That each text you get to give your own meanings to that. Well, that's postmodern. The
even when
anything
I
else
was
before that,
even when I was studying.
it's always what did the
Sorry.
author. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even when I was studying this in the college level, we were studying uh, different ways of understanding interpretation and so forth. And the position that I took was that, we go back to the original author is intended meaning, but there was one that was like where you perceive it based on your own personal interpretation. And that's, to me, that always struck me. And I've actually known people, you probably have too, but I've known people to do that where they treat the Bible like it's one big guessing game where they just kind of say, well, yes, it says that, but what it really means is, that sort of thing.
Or you probably remember this is really popular back in the 90s. What does this verse mean to you? And that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Frankly, I don't care what it means to you. What does it mean? And now, what they're really asking is, how can you apply this in your life? Now, application and interpretation are two different things. They're related, but when we're looking at what does it mean, we're talking about interpretation. And then you can how is this relevant, or how does it apply in my life? So you
Yeah.
can ask that question after you figure out the meaning of the text. Um, so yeah, that I'm a stickler for that. Yes, genre matters, and yes, we need to understand the meaning of the text. One thing I want to clarify, because I think there's excuse me for a second, allergy stuff going on.
That's fine.
Um, Earlier, I brought up the point about Exodus 20 and how would the original audience have understood that. So I think there's been a slight shift, and I should have been careful when I said that. There are certain scholars today who make that the determining factor of the meaning of the text, is how would the original audience have understood it. And so the ancient Near Eastern people do that a lot. Folks like John Walton. Well, this is how that audience would have understood it. It's like, that's a really important question to ask, but it's not the most important question. The most important is, what did the author mean by what he wrote? And the how did the original audience understand it? That can inform it, but sometimes the original audience didn't get it. Think of Jesus telling a parable to his disciples, or even to the non-disciples. They didn't get it so many times, what he said. So we don't base it on what the original audience thought.
Yeah.
We base it on what he said
A,
and what he meant.
a lot of prophecies of the Messiah are that way. We often consider prophecies of the Messiah to have a dual meaning, what it meant to the original audience versus what God actually meant for the prophecy in the future and that sort of thing. Whereas and some people might, perceive a certain passage, oh, this is talking about a particular king, said yes, but it also has this other meaning to it where it actually refers to Jesus Christ and so forth. And so you often see that, and sometimes this kind of shows up and when like Paul or something refers back to the Old Testament and that sort of thing. So you often see this kind of dual meaning to it and that sort of thing. So would that fit
Yeah,
what you're saying here?
well, I'd be reluctant to call it a dual meaning. I don't think that there's different meanings. I think that what you have is, I think there's one meaning to the text, but I think there are, um, oh, nuance. Not that's not the right word. It may apply differently to different people. Maybe that might be a simplistic way of saying it. Um, so when so maybe the classic one you're thinking of is Isaiah 7:14. The behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a child and call his name Emmanuel. It seems like when you read the context of that passage, the rest of chapter 7 and into chapter 8, this is a sign or a prophecy for Ahaz that before this child is born, the two kings that he's afraid of are they're going to be out of the picture. So don't even worry about it. Why are you worried about what you're worried about? We know ultimately that was a prophecy about the virginal conception and birth of Jesus Christ, and Matthew draws that. But I don't think that there were two meanings. I think that it just was a I'm trying to think of the right way to say that. Um, and the reason I bring that up is I think we get ourselves into trouble if we try to say there are two meanings to a text or to a prophecy. I think what you're saying is dual fulfillment. What the way that some people refer to it as
Yeah.
dual fulfillment. So there is an immediate fulfillment, but it looks beyond that immediate fulfillment to this greater thing.
Right.
And that might be a better way to look at it. It's not two meanings. That meaning was already there in the beginning, that this child is going to be named Emmanuel, God with us, you know, um, because it ultimately was looking forward to Jesus. But
Right. All
yeah,
right. Uh we're getting close to the end. So I've got like two more questions in my notes. I want to try to get to it. What is the modern perception of Genesis 1 to 11 as historical narrative? Does most Christians, even a lot of older Christians, they might have a different interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11, but a lot of people do consider it like history or some form of history.
yeah, I think even like you were talking about with William Lane Craig, I think he's still trying to say certain things in there are historical in the sense that there's a real Adam, even though it's not a guy who lives, just thousands of years ago. It's 700,000 years ago. Um, Although I don't think he would hold that there was ever a worldwide flood. So he's denying that as well. But you have people like Hugh Ross, an older creationist, who's a progressive creationist. He would say that he believes that the Genesis 1 through 11 is historical, that these are real events. There really was a flood, but he called it a regional flood or a local flood. He says it's universal, which is just kind of fudge language. So people think he's saying global, but he really means a local or a regional flood. Um, and yet he would still say Noah was a real person and Adam was a real person. So I think most Christians today would still assume that yes, there's a real Adam and Eve. Yes, there was a real Noah, but um, I think we're seeing people drift further and further away from the text, especially as you have all these different leaders like William Lane Craig or like a lot of seminary professors telling you, hey, it doesn't really matter how long ago God created. It doesn't really matter if we take Genesis 1 in a straightforward way, whether they're literal 24-hour days or they're long periods of time. It doesn't really matter. Well, actually, it does matter. God didn't, they're not just suggestions. He didn't just, um, there's a reason those words are written the way that they are. They have a meaning, and our goal must be to find that meaning. And when you have inspired commentary on those chapters by God Himself, the Son of God, telling us what those passages mean, telling us that Adam and Eve were at the beginning, the first male and female were at the beginning. You can't have billions of years before Adam and Eve, or else they're not at the beginning. You can't have Romans 1:20 for Paul says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that men are so that they are without excuse. since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen by whom? By people since the beginning, not since billions of years after the beginning, it's since the beginning. And so there's a consistency to the text if you take it in a straightforward manner. So if you say the literal way, but literal allow when we say literal, we're not talking like a woodenly literal that every single thing has to be taken in a hyper literal sense. We're saying in the plain meaning.
Yeah.
And so if you start Genesis 1 that way and you understand Genesis 1 through 11 as historical narrative, the rest of the Bible is perfectly consistent with it. If you mythologize those things, if you allegorize those things, if you make them poetic, suddenly the rest of the Bible is not consistent with it. And I think that's really all we need to know on which one is the right view.
Right. The funny thing is, I've
Yeah.
always noticed
Yeah, I was
that.
actually,
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying,
no, go ahead. The point I was going to make was going to be way too long. So go ahead. Yeah.
all right. The funny thing is that I often noted that the same exegesis, the same way they interpret Genesis 1 to 11 is not the same way they interpret the rest of Scripture. They would never interpret the Gospels, for example, the way they interpret Genesis 1 to 11. It's often different. They don't use the same method of exegesis. They don't consider context and things like that. I mean, um, and those kinds of things.
It's really interesting. A lot of our hermeneutic textbooks out there, I've got a bunch of these books on my shelf. And
I do.
when I wrote my first book, Old Earth Creationism on Trial, I looked through a lot of them. And what they'll do is a lot of these, hey, there it is. Do you know that thing's already 15 years old? I cannot believe that.
That's
I
another
think
thing.
June of this year, it'll
I
be
was going to
15
say.
years in June.
I'm sorry.
Time for an update.
Right. You wrote that book with Dr. Jason Lau, who's one of my favorite Christian apologists and scientists. I actually had Dr. Lau on here several times, twice on this series so far.
Well,
But
he's the smart one. He's the smart one. They just need a good looking guy for the cover. Um, I'm just kidding.
no, it's
Um,
fine.
but the what I was going to say is I looked through a lot of the different hermeneutics books, and what I noticed is that they would have oftentimes in these books that we would consider to be really good, as far as here are the guidelines, here are the principles for hermeneutics uh, when it comes to literal, when it comes to uh, historical narrative, when it comes to poetry, when it comes to apocalyptic literature, or all these different genres, and then they would have special rules for Genesis 1. And I thought, wait, why? Well, it's so arbitrary that they would come up with special rules for one of them was for creation and climax. So like Revelation gets its own interpretive scheme, and Genesis 1 through 11 gets its own interpretive scheme. It's like that's completely arbitrary when these styles match other styles that we see in scripture. So to me, it seems very, very clearly that it's either theologically motivated or something else rather than just trying to find out what does this text say.
Yeah, but it puts them on very inconsistent grounds. On your book on Oldest Christian on Trial, when I get to Genesis 5, I'm going to be doing a lot of age groups stuff. So I was wondering if because originally I was going to invite you on here when I was in doing, because I'm doing a commentary series, is what I'm doing here. Probably should have explained that at the beginning, but I'm doing a commentary series where I would do like an in-depth of a particular chapter. Then I would go back and do a lot of topological stuff. We're still in chapter 1, but I've got one more video left, and I'll be moving on to chapter 2. And in chapter 2 is when I'm going to be doing a lot of creation versus evolution kind of discussions. But I plan on doing a lot of age of the earth stuff and young earth Christians versus old earth Christians when I get to chapter 5. And I was originally going to invite you on there because you did write that book, and I was hoping to because you're the other side of that team. They wrote the book Old Earth Christians on Trial. I was going to invite you back to discuss young Earth Christianism versus old Earth Christianism. So it'd be those two perspectives. I know that the church fathers didn't use the term young Earth Christianism, but that's because there was no old Earth Christianism to compare it to. But the
It wasn't the
concept of
battle they
young
were
Earth,
fighting at this. It wasn't the battle they were fighting at the time. You know, they
right?
were debating the Trinity and how do we formulate that doctrine, or how do we rightly state that. They were debating the deity of Christ. They were debating different issues at the time, and that's happened throughout church history. You get different eras that are dealing with different issues, and in our day and age, this is one of the big ones: is the age of the earth, and that's where the attack on one of the attacks on scripture. Of course, they're coming from all angles now, but for the last 230, 250 years, this has been a big one.
Right. And like I said, I'll probably invite you back for that discussion. Um,
Okay.
anyway, do you have any concluding thoughts when it comes to Genesis 1 through 11 as historical narrative? Would you say the case for it being presented as real, actual history is very good?
Oh, absolutely. I think the case for Genesis 1 through 11 being historical narrative is solid. And I don't, I think the greatest authority on that is that you have Jesus himself telling us that. Doesn't use that exact wording that it is historical narrative, but treating them as history. The New Testament authors treating it as history. But one thing we didn't bring up, and I can mention this pretty quickly, I think we can get it across. Another area where I think it shows that it's historical, and this might sound weird, and maybe some people will think, oh, wait, you sound like William Lane Craig. No, I'm not going to sound like William Lane Craig. But what we talk about, like flood legends, you might be familiar with that. So we have hundreds of flood legends around the globe that from these ancient cultures talk about a time in the past where there was this catastrophic flood that wiped out all people and the animals except for one family, and oftentimes they mention eight people on a boat, on an ark, on a ship, on a canoe, on a raft, whatever it is, whatever they're familiar with in that culture, and they brought the animals. And sometimes they talk about a rainbow at the end. Sometimes they talk about sending animals off to check how deep the water was. Sometimes I mean, very similar details to what we have in the biblical account. Of course, there's differences as well, because that's what you'd expect over the years of this this tradition or this story, this account being handed down generation after generation after generation. It's going to get distorted. But you have hundreds of those around the globe. Do you know what else you have in those cultures around the globe? You have about 23 different Babel legends that we found that match what's in Genesis 11, where people were building this tower and then the gods were angry or God was angry and changed the language, forced them to scatter, and so very similar. Of course, there's differences as well. You have the same thing happen with the creation of man from the dust of the ground. You have several accounts where man is made from clay, man is made from the ground, and then the great spirit comes along, or this wind comes along and makes him alive. Again, not identical to Genesis 2, but very, very similar. The reason man dies or is wicked has something in over 100 of these ones has something to do with a tree and or a serpent. Where do
Not to
we
mention
read
the flood
that?
legends.
Um, so yeah, well, the flood legend I mentioned at the beginning. The other one that we have all over the place, you have um, so you have like the gods coming down and mating with women and producing demigods. And you have that in these cultures all around the globe. And it sounds very similar to what you see in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, which is what I did my THM thesis on. Um, the sons of God in the Nephilim passage. It's a so all of these details in Genesis 1 through 11 you can find in other cultures in distorted versions. And you find them all around the globe. And then nothing from Genesis 12 onward. They don't have an Abraham legend. They don't have an Isaac myth. They don't have a Jacob story. They don't have any of that stuff. But they have Genesis 1 through 11. Why is that? Because what happened in Genesis 11 at Babel event is true. And that is the world had a shared history up to that point. And then at Genesis 11, God caused them to scatter by changing their language. The last event that they knew that they had a shared history was the Babel event. They took that history with them. Some of them handed it down generation after generation. Of course, the biggest one, the most popular, was the flood, because that would have been a huge event. Um, and they passed these traditions down generation after generation. Sometimes they get distorted, but that kernel of truth is still there. The Bible is giving us the real history of what happened. These other ones are echoes of that history. And I'm not saying that every single flood legend that is out there is evidence of the biblical flood. Sometimes it might just be, okay, there was a really bad river flood 400 years ago, and our ancestors told us about that. But in many of these cases, there are so many similarities that it's hard to believe that that was just about a local event when it matches in so many ways what the biblical account says. And so I think looking at those things, in a strange way, looking at the mythologies of the world, looking at the traditions and the legends, testifies to the historicity of Genesis 1 through 11 as well. Not as mythical events, but as real history. And these other ones are just trying to explain that, but in distorted ways, or in distorted recountings, maybe is a better way to say that. So,
All right, I got a book on my shelf on the flood legends. It's entirely on the flood legends, and it's actually awesome. All the different stories all around the world. Most of these were global and that sort of thing, as far as the flood legend goes. So it's pretty cool to learn about this stuff. When I do videos on the flood, when I do videos on the flood, I do plan on actually or I'm actually wanting to do an entire video on the flood legends. So because I think that that's cool, and I agree with you, there's a kernel of historical truth to it. Obviously over time there's distortions and things like that in some of these legends, and so but I think that it does go back to a common source, and I think the Bible has the true source of the history of the flood and that sort of thing, and all these events and Genesis 1 through 11 and the creation account. You kind of see a much more sober account, like the dimensions of the ark is perfectly matched for to make this vessel seaworthy. But when you go to like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like I mentioned, the boat is like shaped like a cube. Everything's even on all sides, and that would
yeah, and
in terms of
it's a
water.
it's a 7 day, yeah, and it's a 7 day flood that wipes out everything. Well, how are you going to get the water to flood everything in 7 days and to drain off and have dry ground again in 7 days? I mean, yeah, it's just there are clearly nonsensical elements to it in the legends. I think are an interesting piece of evidence for the historicity of the biblical events. One of the arguments skeptics will use is, oh, that's because missionaries went to these places. That doesn't account for all of them. In fact, it doesn't account for a lot of them. Why would a missionary go to a tribe, this group, spend years of their life learning the language and risking their lives just to give them like a distorted version of the flood and other things in Genesis 1 through 11, but not share the gospel? Why do they know about those details, certain things in Genesis 1 through 11, but not the gospel? So that doesn't make sense that missionaries would go and do this. And why would Noah's name suddenly have like 9 syllables instead of just Noah? If the missionaries got there a generation or two before this was written down, that those things don't make any sense to say that it's because of missionaries. No, it's because these traditions, these quote unquote legends were handed down for generation after generation, and they testify to the real history that's described in Genesis 1 through 11.
This book right here that I have right here. Um, this
Yeah.
is a book by Ben Stanhope, who is a theistic evolutionist. It's called Misinterpreting Genesis: How the Creation Museum Misunderstands the Ancient Near Eastern Context of the Bible. And he actually raises that objection that you mentioned up in his book. He also raises up the one that he says that a lot of these are next to bodies of water, and therefore that's why they have these flood stories. But I started thinking about that, and I was like, well, if that was
Most
true,
civilizations are by bodies of water.
yeah, it's true.
That's,
If that was
there's a
true, then
reason for that.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's a reason most civilizations are by water. We need water to live. So, if you're a tribal group, you're going to be by a river, or if you're a coastal people, of course you're by the water. We need water to live, and so yes, there are some cases where it probably is just describing a local devastating flood from hundreds of years ago. But you can't say that about all of them,
Yeah,
and you can't pass it off on missionaries. And that was the subject of my chapter in that Searching for Adam book that you held up by Terry Mortensen. One of the last chapters in the book is the chapter I did, and it was about these different areas of Genesis 1 through 11 that are described in cultures around the globe. And I gave several examples of each one. So if people have that book, they can look into that in more detail.
yeah. One of the things I was thinking of was that if these were just because these areas flood a lot, wouldn't that most of these stories be localized and not global?
Well, that's the interesting thing about it is that many of them are localized to some degree, in that the animals that are described are animals that are local to their region. And then the mountain that the ark lands on, if they describe it, it's like the highest hill or highest mountain in their region. which is interesting because that's one of those distortions that happen. But the Bible doesn't do that. The Bible doesn't name animals that are only specific to Israel. It doesn't name a mountain in Israel. In fact, it names one that's hundreds of miles from Israel, meaning that the biblical writer is treating this as a worldwide event. He's not treating it as something that is borrowed from the Babylonians or the Sumerians and then just making it their own. He's just describing what happened. And uh, that's to me a testimony to the historicity of it rather than being like these flood legends that do end up localizing things or highlighting certain details that are specific to their culture. The Bible doesn't do that.
Right. That is awesome. Well, I thank you for your time.
Brian, good chatting with you. And yeah, when Genesis 5 comes back around, or when you get to there, feel free to contact me and we'll be in touch.
Right. Awesome. Again, thank you. And I guess I'll go ahead and end it. Do you have anything uh, final to say to everybody?
No, just yeah, I would encourage people, don't just take my word for it. When I'm saying what the Bible said, look it up yourself. I'm um, and dig into Scripture. God has given us His word for a reason. It's not just so I can tell you what it says. It's so that you can study it and you can learn it. And so always strive to find out what it is that God is saying through His word, and then live it out and speak the truth in love. That's what we're called to do. So, yeah, I guess I'll
Awesome.
leave it at that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you for your time, and we do appreciate it. And hopefully, maybe we can see you in a little bit. But it's probably going to be a while before I get to chapter 5. I probably won't be doing that until either next year or the after that.
I
But
was gonna
most
say, at
of
the
this
pace
year,
you're going, it might be a while, but
yeah, most of the this year is going to be probably the rest of this year is probably going to be spent in chapter 2 because I'm going to be doing a lot of creation versus evolution stuff, a lot of fossil stuff. I mean, it's going to be huge. So I just can't wait.
okay.
I've been looking forward to doing chapter 2.
I
But
believe it. All right. Well, Brian, good chatting with you, and
okay.
thanks for doing this. Keep standing for the truth.
All right. Thank you very much, and you too. And I will see you later. Thank you again, Tim.
All right. Yeah, God bless.
God bless. Wow, that was some video, wasn't it? Okay. Uh, thank you for joining me on this program, and I thought Tim did a really awesome job going over it. There could be some minor differences. I know he talked about some things that they're probably a little bit more controversial among young Earth creation, and that's fine. I mean, we can differ on certain things. But for the most part, everything was pretty much on par, and it was really good, and I really liked it. I really enjoyed having that discussion with Tim, um, and he got into some things like hermeneutics and things like that, and how we ought to approach the text. And so I thought that was pretty good. That gives us a good idea of how we're supposed to when we're actually reading, because it's important how we read the text, how we interpret the text is important on the course of literary genre. Now, that's probably why this is something that a lot of theistic evolutionists have recently tried to attack, because historical narrative literary genre means we're supposed to take it as actual literal history, as straightforward. It allows for figures of speech, like Tim said, but those figures of speech are going to be heavily contextualized, which means that it's gonna be pretty obvious that it stands out as a figure of speech. Um, Whereas metaphors would bound a lot more abundantly in, say, Hebrew poetry and that sort of thing. Well, anyway, I'm glad that you enjoyed me on here. And I thought this was a very important video because we did end up touching on and talking about the evidence, internal evidence, the textual evidence from the scripture, but also from the actual the text itself, Genesis 1-11. But we also touched on the Old Testament evidence as well as the New Testament evidence, which I think is pretty incredible. that Jesus and the apostles did indeed believe that Genesis 1 to 11 was actual literal history. Um, Thank you for joining me on there. This is we're going to be again. We got one more video in chapter 1 that I want to do. I got to check with Dr. Mortensen see if he's freed up yet to do that video. But I got one more video to do in chapter 1. After that, we're going to move to chapter 2, which we're going to be doing a lot of creation versus evolution things. So if you're not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. Don't forget to like the videos. That help with the YouTube algorithm. It gets these videos out here. And also, don't forget to hit that notification bell, and drop me a comment below. Let me know what you think, and I will see you on the next one. This is Brian Bowen from Apologetics 101 signing off.